Welcome to another video here on The Pulse. Hope you're having a good day. We're going to continue this discussion a little bit about excess deaths with regards to the pandemic and whether or not the vaccine may have played any role in that, and if so, how can we know? And last time we looked at a whole bunch of data from the Office of National Statistics in the United Kingdom. You could check out that video here. You don't necessarily have to watch this previous video to get an idea of what we're going to be talking about today, because today's video is a little bit different, but it does build upon that previous conversation. And Madhava is going to go through a bit of a brief summary of everything we did cover in that previous video. So, if you want a deep dive, definitely watch the other video. But if you want just a very, very high level idea, we are going to cover that in this one. So without further ado, why don't we get into some of this new data here? Well, Madhava, welcome back to the show once again. What do you got for us today as we take this conversation even a little bit deeper here?
Yes, well, I would like to first start off by acknowledging the fact that much of the information and discussion that I bring to the Pulse is detailed and somewhat complicated. But as always, this is the difference between knowing what the data shows and believing what someone else says about the data. So again, I could be criticized for telling you what it shows, but please understand that I am just showing you what I did, and these are my conclusions, and you can judge for yourself whether they are valid or not. And the data's out there if you want to go look at it. But this is what I found, and this is sort of an addendum to the long presentation and information that we talked about recently about grifters and debunking the debunkers. And I wanted to present one more thing here, which I think is going to make it very clear that this is a huge question that has yet to be answered in terms of, is the vaccine contributing to excess mortality? So this was the big takeaway from Dr. Susan Oliver's presentation, which is it looks like that when you look at whole period all-cause age standardized mortality rate, it's way higher in the unvaxxed from the ONS data. And what we did last time was we looked at what the problem is with whole period. And what we saw there is that if you look at the month-to-month mortality rates in different groups, they changed. This was people with the one-shot exposure to the vaccine. The blue line is the unvaccinated people, and you see that over time, the people who got one shot had a higher mortality, depending on what period of the pandemic you were in. Now, this also happened with people who got two doses. Once again, the blue line is the unvaxxed, and we see that for the first few months, all-cause mortality is higher in the unvaxxed, but then changes as time goes on. So that was the issue with just looking at whole period, okay? Then the next question that we approached was what happens with age standardization. Now, this is an interesting finding. And on the left, you see the ratio that Dr. Oliver gave us from the summary from the ONS when you look at age standardized mortality in both groups. But if we actually took the number of people who were unvaccinated, divided by the number of people who were unvaccinated, and did the same thing with people who were ever vaccinated, you would see the graph on the right, where the people who got vaccination had a higher mortality rate. And so what we did next was to unpack why that was. And what we found was that when you age standardize, you are actually looking at two very different groups of people in terms of age. And the contribution to the young people, the young low mortality rates in the unvaccinated was much higher than in the people who got vaccinated. And we saw that with this pie chart right here. The middle is the age distribution of people who were unvaccinated. And it's much different than on the right, the people who got the vaccination. And we were able to conclude these things, that the reason why, if you just look at deaths divided by people, the mortality rate is lower in the unvaccinated because they're younger, not because they were vaccinated or not vaccinated. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
And so then we concluded with, we don't need to age standardize if they give us what happens in each age group. And so what we saw was that the benefit, if that's what you want to call it, from getting vaccination was marginal if you were under the age of 50, and then became more significant as you got older. Now, on the right, we're looking at the same sorts of comparisons in a different part of the pandemic, namely the Omicron period from November to May. And we see that the difference between the unvaccinated and vaccinated mortality rate is less. So there's less of a benefit, which is not so unexpected because we know that the vaccine is not as efficacious or effective against Omicron. So the data is backing up what we saw in real life from around the world. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now I'm going to go to the final problem, which is that the people who get the vaccine and the people who eschew the vaccine or avoid the vaccine are different groups of people. Why are they different groups of people? These are called confounders. Like what is present in one group that's not present in the other? Who is sicker, the vaccinated or unvaccinated? Who is richer? Who has more risky behaviors? So we have not corrected for this when we look at just the ONS data. You cannot peel this apart by looking at just numbers. So this is another reason why this is a very difficult problem to answer, whether or not the vaccination is contributing to all-cause mortality and excess deaths. So what I've decided to do here, and this is the new information, is what we're going to do now is compare not unvaccinated to unvaccinated, but compare people who got one dose, what their mortality rate was soon after the first dose, and 3 weeks later. And this is what you get. The top graph is showing us the one-dosed individuals over the entire pandemic. And what we see is that the blue line, which is the people who recently got the dose within 3 weeks, have a all-cause mortality that is less in every single age group compared to people who got one dose but are 3 weeks out. That's the red line. Moreover, if we look at non-COVID-19 mortality, so these are deaths that have nothing to do with COVID, the difference between the red line and blue line is even greater. So what we can say here is that the risk of dying from something other than COVID is greater 3 weeks from the dose, 3 weeks from your first dose, compared to right after the first dose. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Notice that this is true for every single age group. So this is a pretty powerful signal. And we also see that these are normalized to unvaccinated mortality. What that means is this is a ratio between mortality between the blue and red, or within 3 weeks, greater than 3 weeks. The reason why it's important to normalize is that the mortality rates as you get older are way, way, way higher, thousands of times higher than if you're very young. So this would not be an easy thing to see if we just plotted mortality rates. This also gives us an indication of how high these rates are compared to the unvaccinated. So 1 is actually the mortality rate in the unvaccinated. So when a line is above 1, that means the mortality rate is higher than the unvaccinated. But again, this is not about comparing vaccinated to unvaccinated. It's about comparing vaccinated people within 3 weeks to after 3 weeks. And this is an indication that something is happening to the people who get the first dose after 3 weeks. The rate of death or mortality is higher in every single age group, except for the 10 to 14-year-olds, all cause. But non-COVID, it's higher. Let's see what happens when we look at people who got 2 doses. Once again, now the red line is people who are 6 months out from the second dose compared to people who just got the second dose. In every single age group, all-cause mortality and non-COVID-19 mortality is significantly higher. You know, what we mean here is we're looking at a ratio. So if we go down to the bottom graph and look at, say, 60 to 64-year-olds, we see that the non-COVID-19 mortality rate in people who are 6 months out is almost 4 times higher than the people who just got the second jab. Now, this is really, really important because our trial data, which is the only time we had matched, randomized, placebo-controlled comparisons, did not examine what happened to people after 6 months. They gave everyone the vaccine after 6 months. So we don't have any long-term safety data. Like what happens to mortality? All we know is that after 6 months, there was a slightly larger mortality rate in people who got the vaccine. It was close and relatively small number of people. And that was, I would say hidden from the public or not discussed. So now we're looking at people who are 6 months out, and we see that there is a clear increase in mortality 6 months out of getting the second dose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just to summarize, I'll take a stab here. It's like you're saying when you're just looking at vaccinated people. So let's leave unvaccinated people aside for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
It appears as though in every age group, the more vaccines you have, and as well as the longer you have a vaccine in you, um, the greater the all cause mortality as well as non-COVID mortality is in every age group. I mean, I see 20 to 24 seems very, very close, but pretty well everywhere else, there's a pretty noticeable difference there
Mm-hmm.
um, between the two.
That was almost entirely correct. The thing that I would have to push back on is here we're not looking at amount of vaccine. We're not comparing the amount of vaccine that you have in your body because we're not comparing one dose people to two dose people. We're comparing two dose people to two dose people
Oh,
and
okay.
one dose people to one dose people. But more importantly, it's what happens after time. Is there a long term detriment to being vaccinated given a certain dose, one dose or two doses?
Right. So then the pushback point here would be from, well, hey, then, the waning immunity of the vaccine is why you're seeing the 6 month greater people have more
Mhm.
mortality.
Yes, that would be a legitimate pushback. Absolutely. So, in order to address that, I want to bring up two things. Um, One is the uh, the minimal contribution COVID-19 deaths have to do with all cause deaths, and so I'd like to show you this. Now, what we're looking at here is by age group. What is the proportion of non-COVID-19 deaths to all deaths, to all causes, right? And the point here is not to compare red to blue. The point here is to show you that in every single age group, non-COVID-19 deaths are the overwhelming majority of deaths in every single age group. COVID-19 deaths are a very small proportion of mortality or deaths. So when we see something like this, and we see that non-COVID-19 mortality is significantly higher uh, the longer you've been outside of your dose, we're talking about a large number of deaths, not a tiny number of deaths, a large number of deaths, because, you know, I can tell you, we're just eyeballing it, but in every single group, the lowest percentage uh, of uh, of non-COVID-19 deaths was in the 90-plus-year-old people, where it was about 85%. But in most age groups, non-COVID-19 deaths are greater than 90 or 94% of all the deaths. So we're talking about a large number of people and deaths when we're comparing the two. Now, to address the issue is, well, maybe it's the waning efficacy of the vaccine. And because it's not protecting you against COVID-19, you're not getting the protection against long COVID, which may be contributing to the increased mortality. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So here is the largest study to date, which was published in Nature magazine in May of this year. And the title of the study is "Long COVID Risk Falls Only Slightly After Vaccination." And this is the first page of this summary, is that vaccination against SARS-CoV-2 lowers the risk of long COVID by only 15%. So we're talking about this is not even mortality. This is long COVID. So we're not even looking at deaths. We're just looking at, can you get some of the things that we talked about before? Are we avoiding those things by getting vaccinated? And the answer is yes, but only by about 15%. But if you go back and look at the uh, the ratio of mortality, we're talking 3 or 4 times higher. That's 300 to 400% higher mortality um, in people who are 6 months out compared to people who just got the second jab. So that is, I think, the clearest indication that there is a long-term detriment to these vaccines that have to be weeded out. We can't say for sure that's what's happening, but to say that there's absolutely no contribution of the vaccine to excess deaths is wildly um, inaccurate. We don't know, and there seems to be a tremendous amount of evidence that says there is.
So certainly, a lot of interesting stuff again to consider with regards to this concept of excess deaths and all cause mortality, and as time goes on, we're seeing potentially what these what these interventions are doing. Unfortunately, we don't have that any clinical trial data to show long term problems. So this is kind of like the best we can do. Um, do you? I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, do you think? Maybe this is a silly question, but do you think that health agencies and government agencies are going to look at the long term effects of these vaccines in this way at any point?
I I mean, they should, right? But you're asking me, are they going to? And they've not given any indication that that's what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
If they were truly interested in protecting our health, this discussion that we're having should be on CNN with Sanjay Gupta. Like, why
Yeah,
is all cause mortality higher in people who are 6 months out, and what is going on? Why are things changing after time? These discussions aren't happening,
yeah,
and they should be. And let me just to summarize here. You know, I haven't proven anything
yeah,
like that. Absolutely, the vaccine is causing these things. I'm saying that there's no way to prove. There's no way to prove that they're not causing harm. There isn't. And to be fair, Susan Oliver is this is the person who brought this information to our attention. She is trying to prove the null hypothesis. What that means is she's trying to prove no effect. That is an impossible proof to make
yeah,
because you don't know. All you can say is there is absolutely no possible way from what we know that the vaccine could be contributing. She still can't prove that it's not. It's just like, what do we know? And so it can't be done. But in order to make a strong argument, she has to peel and cut it up the way we have, and look at where are the biases, what happens after time, what happens when we age standardize, what happens when we eliminate the confounders between the unvaccinated and vaccinated. And when you do all of those things, it clearly points to the fact that there's something going on
yeah,
potentially. So that's it's easier to take my position.
yeah. Yeah, I think what you're saying is there's a clear enough signal that something's going on that our attention should be there, especially if we care about the ultimate long term health of people and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's it. That's all. Thanks again for a fantastic little presentation here. And I mean, this one's a little shorter than the others, but I still think very strong information here. So thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me, Joe, and thanks everybody for tuning in and bearing with the discussion and complicated analyses. That's what's required if you really want to push back against people who are telling you that this is what it shows.